Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. Today's guest is writer and organizer Anna Rajagopal. I initially wanted to connect with Anna to discuss some of the writing and their generative critiques of mainstream so-called leftist Jewish orgs. While we do explore these ideas in the episode, and while Anna takes us through their upbringing in Texas, we ended up actually spending a lot of time discussing how organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine have provided the conditions for an entire generation to engage in radical work. While I personally have always resisted generational thinking, and I also have a really hard time feeling hope, I think that this episode offers a vision. Well, Anna's stories actually offer so much, but one thing is that they describe how this generation of organizers are studying and struggling toward a free Palestine, toward freeing us all, in a way that might guide us in the discipline of hope. So here's our episode with Anna Rajagopal. Anna Rajagopal, welcome to Another Education is Possible. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. I just want to start with the very beginning, chronologically. Of course, Judaism isn't the beginning, but where did Judaism begin with you?
I'm pretty vocal or have been in the past and public about conversion because I think it's something that's very stigmatized within the Jewish community. I converted when I was a young child between the ages of like 10 and 11. And for me, my whole family converted at that time. But for me, I think it was about finding community and about identity and about kind of feeling that I fit in that place. Actually, it was this book, All of a Kind Family. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's really old, but I checked it out at the library, Dallas Public Library, and it was about a Jewish family in New York in the 1950s. And I just remember thinking that Sukkot was the coolest holiday ever and wanting to do that so badly. And I don't know, I guess from there, everything else came into play.
That's interesting. I've never thought about this before, but Sukkot has such a distinct feeling to me of it's a fall holiday, right? Sukkot, at least, when I was growing up in the 90s, Sukkot was it was still chilly and at that time, but being in Dallas, that's very different. And I wonder if we could go a little bit more into that. Like what did it feel like to come into, and did the kind of idea of that book come true for you? Was it a place of belonging, and what was that feeling of belonging?
I don't know. I think I had a I was very lucky. I had a very enriching Jewish childhood. I was very, very fortunate because my parents took Jewish tradition, and observance very seriously once we had converted, even before we had converted, because we lived Jewishly before that. Because, there's this whole process that you kind of have to go through before actually being converted. You have to live as a Jew. And so we joined a synagogue, and our first Sukkot, my dad went all out and went to Home Depot, and he bought a lot of wood, and he built a sukkah in our backyard. And I remember thinking that it was the coolest. It was just so cool. And it stayed in our backyard until we left Dallas. And so it was there for 10 years. And it just never left. And I remember watching him kind of the end of the summer painstakingly every day going out there and building the sukkah. So yeah, I don't know. I think my family found a lot of belonging in Judaism. I think that the Southern Jewish community is one that's very close-knit, particularly in Dallas. And I think that everyone knows everyone. And I know that's true everywhere. Jewish geography is the worst thing ever. It was a very familial feeling. And I was very lucky to go to modern Orthodox Jewish day school as well. So I'm very thankful for that.
Interesting. So then the dreaded question of, did that go hand in hand with Zionism?
Yeah. It's actually a very interesting thing. I think that I very much value the Jewish education I received. I think that There's no other experience like being able to spend half of the day learning Navi, Mishnah, Talmud, and then the other half of the day, covering algebra, right? But I think that we were always taught to question things, but the one thing that always, kind of seemed like the center of of Jewish life that never really came into question because no one really bothered to ask, was Israel, was Zionism. And I think that has been true at every Jewish day school. I've been to two Jewish day schools, one in Dallas, one in Houston, and Zionism has definitely been at the very beating heart of both schools. It's a very strange relationship, especially lately. I think I've spent a lot of time reflecting and feeling very torn insofar as like feeling very grateful to have learned the canon Jewishly, but then also feeling frustrated and I don't know, angry at the other side of that, which was, IDF soldiers coming to our schools, teaching us how to carry a gurney, those sorts of things.
I've heard so many metaphors about what Zionist education looks like. You're conjuring something here of, it's like in a horror movie of like, don't open the red door. You can go anywhere in this house, but don't open that door. And I think it'll be interesting as we progress to see what happens when you unlock that, question everything except for this one little thing that
Yeah.
then explodes the entire structure. Could you say a bit more about what this looked like in formal spaces? So the IOF or IDF are
Yeah.
visiting your school. How else were you being educated to be a Zionist?
So I think that Israel was almost the background noise of Jewish day school. And what I mean by that is it was baked into everything. So it wasn't a distinction from Judaism. It was part of it. So, no matter where you were, if it was the Beit Midrash, like where we'd pray, there were pictures of different landscapes in Israel up on the wall at the front. A good portion of our teachers were Israeli, and we're doing, I think, alternate service by teaching in America through an IDF program. We had to learn modern Hebrew, obviously. We were taught to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut, every Israeli holiday that there was. And I think that there was a level of obligation that tied Israel to the Holocaust in a lot of regards in my formal education that was, now I look back on it and can see that there's a level of like manipulative propaganda inherent in, teaching children about mass murder and then saying the only way that you escape this is with ethno-nationalism, right? That's a manipulation of reality. But I think that that's something that I went to a pluralistic Jewish day school, the Emery Weiner School here in Houston, and you had to take a course on Zionism. It was required your senior year, and you had to take a trip to Israel your senior year. They started in Europe. You would visit Auschwitz, all the concentration camps, March of the Living. I don't know if you've probably heard of it. And then immediately, once you're feeling the weight of the Holocaust, you're taken to Israel, and you basically party hard and are told this is freedom, right? I didn't go on that trip. I've never been to Occupy Palestine, but I've watched a lot of people who I went to school with be sucked into that kind of pipeline, which is a choice also.
Yeah, I've heard people say it's like exiting. There's somebody famous who said this, that it's exit through the gift shop, and the gift shop is Palestine. I'm curious, why was there a particular reason that you didn't go on the trip?
Yeah, I was expelled from Jewish day school, actually. I There was a lot of racism at the Emory Wiener School, and I was obviously one of very few non-white students at the school. There were very few non-white families, and they were all pretty close. And there was some pretty horrific racism going on. And I went to the admin and the rabbi, and I was like, this is happening. Kids are being called the N-word and like beaten. Like this is not Jewish values or whatever the nonsense is. And so they didn't do anything. So I went to Fox News and they didn't like that. So I was uninvited from participation in the community.
There's a lot to unpack there. What about in non-formal spaces? Were you encountering a similar education, both in terms of Zionism and possibly similar tensions of both belonging and non-belonging, being a South Asian Jew and being in a space and yet maybe questioned as your Judaism being questioned, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all connected, and I think now that I've exited the quote unquote gift shop, fully aware of the interconnected struggle there. I think that Zionism goes hand in hand with white supremacy, and I think that that is something that is intentional. I felt very alienated. I love Jewish day school for the canonical Jewish learning, but I felt very alienated socially throughout my childhood and into my teen years because it's really tough when, you know, there are other kids around you saying things about specific races and sitting there and feeling implicated in that and thinking, okay, well, we're both Jewish, so I don't understand why what you're doing. And I think socially too, just outside of school, it was also an issue. I think that there's very, very heavy emphasis on Ashken normativity. And I think that there was quite a bit of centric kind of social movement happening as well. And in no part, I think definitely like the fact that a good portion of the Dallas Jewish community had influence from Israel, like immigrants coming from Israel had to do with that. I think that Israel very intentionally tries to homogeneize Jewish identity under Ashken normativity. But yeah, no, definitely difficult. And I think that afterward, you know, now once the kind of dust is cleared and I'm not in those spaces anymore, it's easy to go back and say, okay, well, the fact that they were being racist to me and also racist to Palestinians, no brainer, right? But I think when you're kind of raised in the pipeline um, of that and growing up kind of questioning it and then being punished for questioning it, I think that it's a little harder to see.
This isn't an endpoint, and there's not a being on the other side necessarily. But how did you start to get out of the pipeline?
I'm going to preface it by saying I tried really hard not to center this narrative lately because of everything happening in Palestine. I think Jewish people are given quite a bit of space to feel feelings, and that takes away from the material reality of Palestinians. And I think that we take up way too much space in general when it comes to conversations about Zionism. But this is a Jewish space, and so I think, yeah, it makes sense. But I was very fortunate to have people who were very patient with me, there were Palestinian and also Jew of color anti-Zionist comrades who took the time to call me out and call me in and gave of me hours of their time and energy to talk through Zionism and the fact that, you know, I was engaging in something horrific and not helpful. And I remember like one of the first conversations I had with a Palestinian comrade who I'm still quite close with was she said something like, you know, you think you're doing the right thing, you're using like all this language of like anti-colonial, like indigenous, anti-racist, but you're not helping at all. You're hurting. And I think that I was very much in the liberal Zionist kind of Jew of color space, which is, I think, young Jews of color tend to get swept up into the trap of being told that Israel is the only reason that Jews of color are still alive, which is not true in the slightest. And there's kind of this it's almost an Orientalist framework of language that gets spun where Jewish nationalism tries so hard to make itself indigenous, right? But it's not. And I think that I was caught in the language of social justice without understanding anything that I was saying, because that's what you're taught to do. You're taught to parrot. But I, again, was very fortunate to be in community with people who told me to shut up. So I think that's where it kind of stopped for me in like 2020, 2021, maybe.
And there's something you're hitting on here that's well explored, but the insidious way that Zionism operationalizes social justice language, and you know that famous indigenous person, Gail Godot, Gail,
Oh,
you know,
Gal Gadot?
yeah, you know this indigenous claim that's made to the Levant, and the
Yeah.
way that Zionism is presented as the enactment of social justice and the realization of queer liberation and making the desert bloom, all of this, like, we won't get into the pinkwashing, the greenwashing, all of this, but I think you're hitting on how that has been used to further Zionist aims. I really appreciate what you're saying of in a podcast like this that is trying to invite Jews in to unmake Zionism and challenge Zionism and think about where they can take up the work, it's important. But it's not important to, say, center our voices in the Palestinian solidarity movement or in the liberation struggle in general. I would imagine that things then moved very quickly for you. If 2020, 2021, you're having these conversations, what happens from there?
So I was having these conversations with Palestinian people and Jews of color who had unlearned Zionism to some extent. And I made the decision to move very far away from Zionism, and I started slowly and then very quickly. And they don't let you leave easily, is something that I learned. They don't want you to unlearn. I think I received very angry text messages from Chen Mazig and Debbie Lechtman and that whole crowd of millennial Hasburis saying, we need to get you on a phone call right now. The three of us need to sit down and talk to you. These people are in their 30s. I'm 19, 20. And they're saying, we need to talk to you. You're hurting Jewish people. Like, you are being anti-Semitic. We need to sit down. It's disgusting what you're doing. And I was like, no, I actually don't want to get on a call with you three. Sorry. No. I think that like the level of kind of, I don't even know if the right word is abuse or political grooming, but the level of kind of indoctrination that I think happens on the internet right now. There are a lot of other Jews of color who are in my age group who had very similar experiences of trying to leave Zionism and not being able to or struggling. I remember when I started to post things that were anti-Zionist, I got an email, and my parents also got an email. I don't know how they found my parents' emails saying if Anna doesn't denounce anti-Zionism and come back to Zionism, we are going to release your home address. And they had set up a website, populated it with my information, my address, all these things. They were sending us pictures of our house, and they were saying, if you don't delete all of your posts that are anti-Zionist and apologize for this, we're going to, really let you have it. And we won't stop until it was very threatening language. We won't stop until your whole family is, hurt. And so I think for me, it was really hard to leave physically and emotionally. It was hard to leave, not in mentally. Mentally is very easy to separate yourself once you understand it to be propaganda. But I think they don't want you to escape. And I think that there's a reason for that, because once you unlearn Zionism, you help other people unlearn Zionism. It's much easier for them to set up websites and, threaten you with whatever than it is to let you go. And so I think for me, it was a period of escape more so as in like operational security and protecting my identity and realizing that, oh, having my full name on the internet was actually a mistake because these people are not normal.
I don't want to put words into your life experiences, but there's a big push now to say those of us who come from an anti-Zionist standpoint aren't actually Jews. And for me, you can't see us through the podcast, but like I'm putting air quotes around it. Like I don't look super Jewish unless I really let my hair grow out, my beard grow out, put on my glasses. You can hear I'm doing it with the voice now. Like, I can become Jewish, but I've never had that question before until I became much more public with my anti-Zionism. But that was the first time for me in decades that I've ever been. I've heard people call it un-Jews, impossible Jews is a term I've been playing with, kind of borrowing from Arab Jewish scholar Ella Shohat. But I would imagine it seemed like you were hinting at that this might not be the first time that your Judaism is called into question.
Yeah, definitely not. I've been very used to it since my family's entered Jewish spaces. There's a level of even the idea of like looking Jewish, right? That's something that's made up. That's made
Right.
up to like Ashkenazi-centric standards because anyone can look Jewish. Jewish means a million things and it means nothing. And I think that, for us, my family, it's tough to walk into a space and then be asked, why are you here? To walk into Shabbat services and be asked by a security guard, what are you doing here? That's not that's not a Jewish experience. And I think the question also of what's your Jewish journey? Tell me your Jewish journey. Like that one, where are you guys really from? Like you're half Jewish, right? So these sorts of things are something that like I think is baked into being a Jew of color. I think that that's something that it's inescapable. It's the racism that exists in the Jewish community, which is intimately tied to the Zionism, right? And so, no, I'm very used to it. I'm very used to the whole infiltrator language, or that I, converted to be a anti-Zionist, which I wish I had. That would be so cool. Unfortunately, my my background is not that radical. But yeah, I think that it's not as jarring when you've heard it your whole life. When that's the first thing that you heard coming into Jewish spaces is you don't belong here. So it doesn't faze me because I also, besides knowing my innate value as a Jewish person, I know a lot more than every Zionist who's saying that I'm not Jewish. I spent half my day learning Hebrew and studying Torah. Like, I promise you, I know more than you do. And that's not to say they aren't Jewish. It's just to say you shouldn't throw stones at a glass house.
Yeah. And I do I will say many things about Zionists and call many of them genocidal monsters, but I don't question their Judaism, which is a separate thing.
Yeah,
Uh,
because and I think the reason that they question our Judaism is because, and I've talked about this before, and it's the same reason there's anti-convert sentiment in the community is because they've tied Jewishness to blood quanta, and they've tied that back to Israel. So the
yeah.
whole, I'm indigenous, I'm from the Levant, look at my blood. I've seen Zionist content creators post things like reclaiming Jewish hooded eyelids and raccoon eyes, and I'm like, that's just race science. You sound like a Nazi.
Yeah.
So I think there's like a huge push, and I think conversion kind of undermines it because anyone can convert anywhere in the world. And that you don't have an innate connection to a land if you convert into something. I don't have any connection to Occupy Palestine other than being an organizer in a movement. So I think it undermines the claim that it's in our DNA, which I think is an anti-Semitic claim that has come out of the Holocaust that has been repurposed and used for Zionism. But yeah, no, I don't think we as an anti-Zionist more broadly, I don't see it as a trend questioning their Jewishness because I think it's a very low tactic. It's punching very low, and I don't think that that's something that there's no strategic use for us to do that, only for them.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about your ongoing journey. If you're saying these conversations are happening when you're 19, this is when you're in undergrad.
Yeah, it was
Uh,
my freshman year of college.
so as you go through this unlearning process, are you engaging? You're talking to friends and comrades. Are you also doing anything more formalized, joining orgs at university, taking courses, things to further this form of study?
Yeah, so I transferred to Rice University the beginning of my junior year. COVID had hit, and so I was home for a long time just doing virtual study because no one was allowed in the dorms. And then I decided, I'm in Houston anyway, might as well just transfer to Rice. And I did. And at Rice, I was lucky to meet some incredible comrades who were Palestinian, Black organizers and interested in creating a movement on campus. And so together, myself and a few others formed Rice University Students for Justice in Palestine in 2021, and it's still going strong. Hopefully, it will continue. And I think that campus is where it really started for me in real life, like organizing and working with other people, building organizing relationships and those sorts of things in the context of Palestine specifically.
Hmm. And I think there might be a parallel track again. I don't want to put words into your experience, but I came to know of you through your writing. Are you also beginning to write about Palestine and to write about anti-Zionism and just study writing in general?
Yeah, I graduated with an English degree, which is actually useless monetarily, but rhetorically, it has a little bit of power. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of artists within the movement, Palestinian artists have been saying that it's the obligation of anyone who has a craft to use that craft toward the movement. And I think that that's true. I don't think that I have anything more important to say or anything new to say that Palestinians haven't already been saying for over 100 years. But I know how to take up space in Jewish spaces and I know how to piss Jewish people off. Those are two of my greatest talents. And so I think that there is utility in writing. I think there's utility in challenging intercommunal Zionist hegemony. I think there's utility in using my degree in my craft toward journalism. It's something that's really important to me. I have been a guest contributor and a guest writer for the Institute for Palestine Studies for several years now. And it has been the greatest honor of my life sitting there and being able to transcribe the words of people in Gaza. I think there's real power in that. And honestly, nothing else that I've done actually matters compared to that work.
Hmm. Do you feel like that built on a lot of your shared study and learning with folks in SJP?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's always a need for writing in SJP. There's always a need for someone to write a press release, to spin a social media post, to, clap back at propaganda. And absolutely, I think that writing and building relationships through the Institute for Palestine Studies, through organizing in Houston more broadly, everything is connected. The movement is it's a very big movement, but it's also a very small place. Everyone knows everyone. And so I think that my organizing relationships have been strengthened by committing myself to exploring as many avenues as possible to engage in anti-Zionist praxis. And I think that, especially on the campus, that writing is something that is used very tactfully by Zionists. And I think that we also have the power to write op-eds that change policies. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of using that.
You're hitting on, obviously, we want to talk a lot about what anti-Zionist praxis looks like. But before we get into that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how, so between this big shift in your identity and your life and your thinking and the present, where's Judaism factoring in there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I wish you could tell me. I think it's a very complicated relationship. I think my relationship to Judaism is very complicated. My first instinct is to say it doesn't matter. That's the first kind of thing that I've come to realize is like the Jewish urge to say I'm an anti-Zionist Jew. I That doesn't matter. You're an anti-Zionist. Whether or not you're Jewish is immaterial in the struggle, other than the context of having or yielding power. I think that we tend to make ourselves special in the movement or think we have some sort of higher knowledge or experience or practice than anybody else, when that couldn't be further from the truth. And I think that, so for me, it's complicated. I think I try really hard to decenter my Jewishness when I organize because it's not relevant unless I use it strategically to counter Zionist claims or to do things that comrades who maybe are Arab or Palestinian can't necessarily do without pushback. Those are the only times that I found utility in being Jewish lately. I think that for the rest of the time, it's been a really complicated internal struggle. And it's one that I have been having long, tearful conversations and angry conversations with other anti-Zionist Jewish people I've grown up with who are on the same page I am or have similar life experiences as to what do we do? Like what comes next? And the answer to that question is it doesn't matter. And I think we're too focused on that question. So I think for me, I guess the short answer is it's everywhere and also nowhere. It propels me, but it also never comes up.
I think there's a lot in there. I think you're saying that, it can be a cudgel, right? It's useful at times. And this is also obviously divorced from the question of asking you, Anna Rajagopal, about your Judaism personally, right? Not as a personal practice. I'm asking how it factors into your organizing work, which is where you're saying this convoluted, difficult question.
It's hard because I think we as Jewish people owe the movement the ability to shield our comrades who are more vulnerable from critique and baseless accusations of anti-Semitism. I think that our Jewish identity is very useful in doing that. And I think that I've employed it strategically in that regard. But I can also see in organizing spaces where it takes up too much space and where it doesn't
Yeah.
matter. And so for me, I don't really want to be recognizably Jewish in organizing spaces because I see it as a distraction for movement building. I don't think that anyone needs to act differently towards Jewish people in any way that's special or, I don't know. I think there's a real kind of deference, and I think that there's a real level of respect that Jewish people don't deserve more than anyone else that's being given in movement spaces. And so I suppose my Jewish identity comes out when I need it, but otherwise stays dormant, like the Hulk and his anger, I suppose.
Our, our Judaism is it's a fiery rage that we can
Mm,
vaguely control to use
yeah,
for,
there you go.
yeah, but a liberatory Hulk, hopefully.
Yeah, a
Yeah,
liberatory Hulk for sure.
yeah,
Why he's green?
yeah. I mean, I'm not going to get into the nerdy aspects of
Oh yeah.
many versions of the Hulk, but anyway, I also think there's something there. Actually, one of our upcoming guests right before you, who's also a writer, Allison Glick, organized this beautiful panel in Philadelphia. This amazing, profound event. This historian, God, I'm going to butcher both people's names, Nitzan Lebovich, gave this great talk about histories of Nakbas, and he has a very specific rule where he says he won't speak unless he's formerly Israeli professor in the U.S. said he won't speak unless he's speaking with a Palestinian on Palestine. One person was denied a visa, another person didn't feel safe, and the organizers, Allison and her co-organizer, really tried to convince him and said, please do this. He gave a great talk. People found it very profound. And at the end, the part that moved me the most was this amazing poet and translator. Her name is, I think, Huda Fakhreddin. I apologize if I'm butchering that, but she's this amazing Palestinian poet. And she said, Nisam, I'm so glad you have that policy, but you need to speak. The Palestinian, your counterpart, is dead. And they mean that literally for the two people who had been scheduled to join Nissan, but said, you need to stand up and use your voice at this moment in the most forceful way. And it is your responsibility and your obligation as a Jew in this way to stand up. And I think that in that sense, speaking and acting Jewishly or as Jews is urgent. But I totally agree with the idea of we do not need, we do not need to center ourselves or speak in Palestinian spaces. We do not that's one of the things that's so powerful about anti-Zionism. Anybody can do anti-Zionist work. There is no qualification to do that. You can stand up for liberation and support this movement for freedom and without having any particular knowledge, skills, anything. You bring what you can to this fight. But beyond my rambling, I'm wondering where else this led. So you started to speak a little bit about anti-Zionist praxis. As you're writing, as you're working with SJP, what else are you taking up at this time?
Yeah, I have worked two jobs in institutional Jewish life, and I will never do it again because I was, for many reasons, but principally because they're Zionist and I was fired from both jobs, which weren't Zionist in description or in nature. They were both aimed at Jewish diasporic enrichment. But if you get too into the diaspora, they don't like you. So I was fired from both. And when I was fired, very publicly and doxed, I was reached out to by Judaism on Our Own Terms, which
Mm.
is an incredible transnational organization and broader movement to fundamentally alter Jewish life on campuses and give Jewish people alternate spaces to express Jewishness that aren't Zionist. It's such an important thing to change our communities, right? It's such an important thing to alter them. And it's a quiet work. It's not a noisy work. And so I think a lot of my time and energy goes into Jute and also, the campaigns that have sprung up as a result of being in contact with radical young Jewish people like Drop Hillel and things of that nature. So a lot of my time has gone over the last few years to having tough conversations with young Jewish people who are frustrated and don't know where to put their energy, and also with young Jewish people who know exactly where to put their energy and just need help channeling it. So I think, yeah, Jewishly, there's a lot happening.
Yeah. And you're hitting on there the fact that this work is both slow and quiet while existing in a space that is very urgent and timely and needs a lot of attention. I wonder how you balance that kind of these two things of having small conversations with folks through Jute, but also trying to get at the baseline we need to fight to end the genocide instantly. And
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think the work of people such as myself, so that is recent alum who are Jewish and who are in Jewish organizing spaces towards Palestinian liberation, has to be a quiet work, but I don't think that means that all the work of Jewish anti-Zionists has to be quiet. I think a lot of our energy goes into supporting radical Jewish movement building on campuses and Jewish students who need to be loud about their work, who need to chain themselves to Columbia's gates, who need to escalate, mobilize, and agitate, and use their Jewishness strategically to do that. So I think my work is quieter, but it's balanced out by trying to be, in any way, a support to the students who are doing everything they can on the front lines of our campuses and in our cities to stop the war machine. And I think it's not only Jewish people who are doing that, right? I mean, there are countless Palestinian, Arab, and non-Jewish students who are facing the repercussions that a lot of Jewish people won't end up facing. A lot of Jewish people may not even be arrested. If they're arrested, they may be let go. But, we can't say the same for our Arab and Palestinian comrades, not our Black comrades, Indigenous comrades. So I think that there's a lot of really important work being done right now. And I think that my goal in this moment is to support it in any way I can and amplify it.
And I think what I'm hearing there might be that, do you think the center of this is on college campuses with younger people?
Ugh, this is a question. I think about this all the time, actually. No, I don't. I don't. I want to fight that. I saw Angela Davis speak recently, and she's obviously incredible, but she's also neoliberal and drives me up the wall. And she said that we need to save the universities because they are the front line of organizing, and they are where organizing begins, and they're where critical thought happens. And I actually disagree with that. I don't think we need to salvage the university. I don't think that the university is the end all be all of organizing. I think that that structure is harmful because what happens is you age out. If you're not Palestinian or Arab and you don't want to join a liberal organization like JVP, you age out, right? So you can go to PYM or you can go to JVP if you're Jewish. But if you're not, and if you're at neither of those, there's really no outlet for you to organize for Palestine. So I think by centering the campuses only, we're doing ourselves a disservice. That doesn't mean I don't think that they're an important part of the struggle, because absolutely they are. They're where the violation of civil rights, we've seen that happen, on the forefront for the last, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But I think that we're also forgetting that the battle is also in our cities. It's in our city halls. It's in the financial buildings. It's in the weapons companies that are in our cities. It's in the gas companies that need to be shut down and need to stop pillaging land, right? I don't think that the campus is the end all be all for organizing. And I think that there's a real power in the masses, in the people understanding that they have just as much, if not more, power than the students do, right? I think centering the campuses is an elitist kind of way of making sure that organizing doesn't trickle down to everyone else. And I don't think that's fair. I think that organizing is a public good that must be done by everyone. And that includes campuses, but more principally, the streets are where we should be.
I agree. I also think there's something to not campuses. I think probably we should, I mean, I speak as a professor, but I think we should be burning universities to the ground. And there's I deeply appreciate critical university studies, but I much more appreciate the idea of abolitionist universities. And but what I do think is something that you and I talked about when preparing for this interview, which is, God, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but like, I think there is hope in the current generation. And I think one thing that I'm fascinated by is how the encampments fundamentally challenged the supremacy of the universities by offering a type of education and by breaking down the borders that you're saying of the university as this elite space. At least the encampments that I was kind of on the edge of as somebody who lives nearby, as somebody who's involved in orgs, and showing a type of educational life and a radical way of doing things that deeply connected to other forms of action and other ways of learning. I think what you and I mentioned is you basically shared some frustrations with my generation of millennials, which I deeply share, but I don't want to assume that you're then thinking that there is then hope in younger generations.
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I think so there was this incredible thread that Good Shepherd Collective and Workshops for Gaza on Twitter had kind of co-created through quote tweeting about the abolition of the university and about reconstructing popular education, which, they both named as being an incredibly difficult feat through alternate, avenues, right? That aren't the ivory tower. And I've been reading some of the work of those two organizations just kind of online, and I've really appreciated the way that they've approached the idea of abolition of, the system. Because we can talk all day about like challenging the system from within, but at the end of the day, like there's only so much you can do. But our goal is to stop imminent genocide in Gaza, which our universities are funding. So there's also that. I think the encampments presented a very energizing moment, one that is past that I think we need to reignite. I think we had an encampment at Rice University. There was also one at University of Houston. And at the one at Rice University, we saw community members and college students come and spend, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 hours on the lawn learning from Palestinian organizers, from, organizations like Anak, from, PYM, et cetera. And there was something really powerful about the popular university for Gaza. I think that the popular university as a concept is something that has a lot of potential. I think that it's something that we need to think about more critically, though, outside of the context of universities, because the popular universities are still happening on campuses. And to a degree, there's an inaccessibility on campuses. I'm afraid to go on college campus as an alum. I don't want to be there. It's daunting. I can't imagine how people who didn't go to the particular university feel about coming into that space. It's a very carnivorous space, universities. It's a cannibalistic environment. Campuses are, and it's a violent environment. Classrooms are spaces of violence. I think that the encampments represent a shift in the way we understand education. And I think that we just need to take that a step further. I will say, yes, I'm very frustrated at millennials, you excluded. You're one of the good ones. Um,
As
but
long as I can be a bad Jew, I'd
oh yeah,
prefer to be a
yeah.
bad millennial, but I'll.
You can be a
Or,
good millennial and a bad Jew. We'll do. I think
thank you.
we, we talked about this earlier. So I'm 24. I turned 24 in October. And so I graduated college in 2023. And I want to go to grad school, but maybe I actually shouldn't because abolition of university. Oh well. But I think that there is a level of neoliberalism to millennial, anti-Zionist, Jewish organizers, particularly of the white variety. And it's not one that I see mirrored in Palestinian and Arab organizers. And so that leads me to believe that it is not an issue of age necessarily, but an issue of socialization. Someone on Twitter had said that the reason that, younger Jewish people on campuses are more radical and are more able to embrace the right to resistance, are more able to embrace the fact that borders are meaningless, that no human being is illegal because legality is a construct, these sorts of things, more radical lines of thinking. Radical, I hate that word because it's not radical, but it's because of exposure to SJPs, Palestinian and Arab organizers, BIPOC organizers, etc., and being in community with people who are not just white Jewish people who live in Miami, right? And I think that I'm not saying that the work that has been done is not important. I am saying that JVP National is a crock of shit. And I do think that if not now is too. I think that millennial anti-Zionist Jewish people have decided that they're willing to say ceasefire now, and they're willing to say that until they're not allowed in organizing spaces. And I'm gonna take words now from an anti-Zionist Jewish organizer on a college campus who I very much respect but won't name for privacy. But they had told me JVP National won't say right to resistance until they're barred from organizing spaces. They didn't even identify themselves as anti-Zionist until that became the litmus test for joining organizing spaces in the mainstream. So I really do think that these orgs will go as far as we'll let them and as far as we want them to go. So when the barrier for entry to organizing spaces changes and JVP realizes that their Instagram posts aren't getting enough likes, they're going to change their tune and right to resistance is going to be popular, right? I think only recently they've begun to take up more radical lines of language, and it looks very goofy looking at their posts today and then going back to October 7th, 2 years ago, and seeing them talk about coexistence. It's not genuine. And we know it's not genuine. We know that it's the function of the NGO-ification of organizing. And this young Jewish organizer who I was speaking with was telling me, we need to change the barriers of entry so that JVP either gets with the program or they don't get in. And I think that that's entirely true. And I think young Jewish people on college campuses are going to do that. I think that a lot of the organizing that they're doing is reactive. And I think that a lot of their time is going to that. But I also think that there are a good amount of them who want to proactively shift away from the framework of, holding hands and singing ceasefire now, because that's not doing anything, right? Are we at a yoga retreat in California? So yeah, I am frustrated with millennial Jewish people. That's actually my least favorite flavor of Jewish person is white millennial, anyone over 30. But that's only because I think that there's a lack of exposure to radical organizing. And young Jewish students on campuses today are hand in hand with young Palestinian and Arab organizers. JVP on college campuses is much different than JVP national. JVP on college campuses, they have intense relationships with their SJPs, right? And that there's a reason for that. There's a reason that that coalition building exists, and it's because there's a split generationally, and it's gonna continue to divide Jewish organizing until JVP is overtaken by radical thought, which I hope happens soon.
It's funny because what you're saying is fiery and radical, but there's a real sensitivity and compassion in it that you're essentially not letting a generation off the hook, but saying there were not the conditions to support radicalization. There were not the conditions to actually act in solidarity or think against whiteness because, God, I mean, I I can speak from experience that I was never exposed to those things. That was never an option for me. Again, not to say, oh, therefore I shouldn't be held to account, but I think yeah, it's also not to then lift up a different generation and say, oh, look how triumphant they are, because that's a very neoliberal way of thinking as well, right? It's to say that the conditions have changed, but that's also happening as the real material conditions for organizing here in the US and much more horrifying everyday conditions in Palestine are just it's unlivable.
It is. And I think when you push people to their limit, work happens, right? Gears turn. And I think that, yeah, if you're a white person and I don't know, when people in 30 were in college, what, 2005? In college at that time, JVP's just being founded. Zionism hasn't really been challenged on the institutional level in Jewish spaces. Yeah, I understand how that could be hard, but I think that like we're here now. What are you doing, right? And I think so much has shifted just in the last 5 years for anti-Zionist Jewish organizing. And I don't know, I think that there's no excuse for maintaining the I went on birthright and now Israel's bad awe. Like, that's not a political line that we need to entertain anymore. We need to support the right of Palestinian people to resist their occupiers. We need to support the right of return. We need to support what decolonization means outside of the theoretical. And I think that there's an ambivalence to doing that in white Jewish millennial spaces, even Jewish currents. I have an enormous, they know I have a bone to pick with them because I'm always tweeting about how much I hate them. Even Jewish currents, which is considered the quote unquote home of the Jewish left. That terrifies me. If that's the home of the Jewish left, then we're screwed. Because why are you getting your feelings hurt over Mohammed El-Kurd talking about his reality? Like, I mean, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. Like, go to therapy, get a journal. Like, I don't know. Let's be normal. So I think that like there's an ambivalence to change because there is a lot of self-righteousness and arrogance and pretentiousness and almost like a savior complex that has developed out of the NGO-ification of anti-Zionist Jewish organizing. And that savior complex is very dangerous for all of our comrades and also for our community building. And it is tearing relationships and coalitions apart, and it needs to stop. And I spoke about this in a Mondoweiss article, and a local comrade who's phenomenal spoke about this on a podcast recently about kind of the saving of the Jewish soul that is given priority over Palestinian life, right? And I think that that's where we come right back around to that. And I think if we don't move away from that, I don't know. I don't know what our future looks like. So,
Yeah. Which I think, you're pointing out a very specific book by a very specific author. And I think there's a great contrast between this idea of perfect victims and who are producing this idea and this idea of recoverable recentering of quote unquote Jewish left. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's something entwined here about how the Jewish left remakes itself, or the so-called Jewish left remakes itself over and over to make sure that they're like the cool Jews.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
No, 100%. There is like this level of it's like the barrier to entry thing. Like they'll go as far as they can to be as liberal as possible until it's a limit to their entry into mainstream, right? So,
Yeah. But I do wonder about the opposite end of this. We talked about this just a little bit that, I talk to most of the folks in my life outside of my very, I have kind of concentric circles slowly moving outward, right? I have my very close friends who I can speak to and say anything, even if we don't agree politically. I also have my closest comrades in organizing circles, and we're speaking the same language. If I go right outside of that and I'm still in a world where we would say decolonial, we'd all read the same books, but it's not in a real sense, all of a sudden for them, they're like, wait, why would you critique Jewish currents? I go outside of that, and they're like, wait. Like, at some point you get to the point where we start calling Kamala Harris and Joe Biden communists. And right, it's like, I do wonder about this idea of how you balance the need to call people out on their bullshit and call orgs out on their bullshit, but also making sure we're not just like doing this constant, right? The number of times that I'm like, can we not have the anarchist communist fight? Can we just
Yeah.
agree that as long as we are materially anti-imperialist, we're all on the same page?
I think the problem is that we aren't materially anti-imperialist, so we're not on the same page because the people writing op-eds about why, or people publishing books right now that go by titles like Being Jewish After Gaza,
I knew
like
you were going there.
that,
Yeah.
we don't live in the same universe. You do not live on the same plane as I do. I don't know what you're doing in your free time, but it's not what I'm doing. And I think that until we're able to be in practice anti-imperialist, then we can stop with the critique. I don't like the frame of infighting. I hate that framework actually, because I think that it takes away from necessary growth that has to happen. People have to be called in. We have to be called to account. Palestinians shouldn't have to do it. Arab people shouldn't have to do it. Black people shouldn't have to do it, right? If if I see Jewish bullshit, I'm gonna call it Jewish bullshit, and that's not gonna change. I think that, but that's as me as an individual, right? I wouldn't advocate for that on the board of Jew, right? I wouldn't say let's go make a post, lambasting JVP because that's not strategic, right? So as an individual, yes, of course, I'm always gonna call mass movement building on the Jewish left to account because that's my job. And at the same time, I think there's a way to balance, quote unquote, dividing the movement to the public. And that is just building alternative spaces, having those conversations in private, asking more of our comrades one-on-one, those sorts of things. It doesn't mean I'm not going to quote tweet JVP and say, what are you doing? This is ridiculous. But it does mean that when we're having conversations about building alternative Jewish spaces, we're not building them as oppositional to JVP. That's not how they're defined. They're defined because they're radical in and of themselves. And I think that that's really important to frame building new Jewish community not as oppositional to liberal Judaism, but as a necessary part of the work of being accountable. And so, yeah, I think that the critique is important. I think that there's a way to be strategic about critique. But I also have gotten to the point in my organizing life where I don't care as much as I used to about optics. I hate the word optics, but when it comes to Jewish movement building specifically, because I don't see revolutionary potential in the Jewish movement building that's happening right now. So I don't take it seriously on the level of like JVP National, if not now. So my critiques of them, to me, it's immaterial because they're not going to change. Our only choice is to abandon them and to create radical spaces that Palestinians have asked us to create.
I really, really appreciate that because I've struggled to articulate this with folks with whom I'm organizing, but a lot of us come to this with this feeling of we're frustrated with JVP, but we have to be more than just anti-JVP. You're right. Like I do think that infighting within this conversation is the wrong term, and there is something productive in doing this, but it comes along with the idea of, and yet I'm not going to be such a purist or sectarian as to say, well, I'm not going to that march because they've signed up for it. It's letting them be there, understanding what they are, knowing that sometimes you can go there when it's useful or relevant, and building something else simultaneously that doesn't use that as a reference point and thus recenter, right? Do what the people who find it more important to argue about the Star of David than actually fight for Palestinian
No,
life.
exactly. I think be a mensch about it. I mean, like there's a level of discernment that we can make as human beings insofar as like I'm not going to boycott a march that PYM is signed on to just because JVP National endorsed it. I mean, that's ridiculous. Like we need to maintain our solidarity with the coalitions we've built. And sometimes those decisions are strategic. I understand that as an organizer. And at the same time, we can ask for more. And I think that that's a reality a lot of people have trouble holding space for, but I think that it's something that we have to do. And I think too often we let big national orgs off the hook. And I don't like that. I don't like the kind of photo oppiness that JVP National's Instagram has turned into of like putting young brown and black Jewish people in red rolls to get arrested and then not supporting them in their arrests and then posting about it. That to me is like war profiteering. Publishing books about genocide when you're Jewish and making money off that, that's war profiteering. So there are definitely there are levels of critique that I think are necessary, just accountability wise. Some people just need to be slapped in the face. But at the same time, like you can be a mensch, like you can understand strategy. I mean, we all have a brain, right? Hopefully, well, some of us, most of us.
Yeah. Sometimes it needs to be activated a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think as we come to the end here, there's a really key question about how this is not the end. You were very intentional in saying, I want to talk about unlearning as part of a process, but I do think that anti-Zionism is a very specific and necessary standpoint, but that is not the achievement of an objective, right? You said, I want to talk about how I am always learning and unlearning. I'm always doing this work. And I'd love to hear a little bit about what's happening now as you continue the process, as you keep engaging.
I like to call myself a perpetual student because I am of the movement. Um, I've said I am fortunate like a million times on this podcast, so I'm so sorry, but I am. I'm very, very lucky. I'm very fortunate to be alive when I'm alive, and to be alive alongside the people I'm alive with. There are Palestinian leaders in PYM and in national organizations like Al Auda and there are leaders in Anak Bayan and in DSA and in PSL. Like there are people around me who are a whole lot smarter than I am and who have much more important words and ideas. And I am very lucky to always be learning from them. And sometimes it's really painful to do that. I saw recently this Instagram account in Texas. I think it's a Texas Palestine account. Post one of my rabbis from my childhood, calling them out on something. And it was a very painful post because the rabbi did something in the community that was horrific, and the account was calling him to account, which is arguably a good thing. But I remember in that moment, like last week, feeling like, oh, I don't. This is a weird feeling. Like it's important that this rabbi is called out, but this is also someone from my childhood who taught me. So where are my feelings on this? And like I can tell when I still have unlearning to do Jewishly because I get this kind of like this feeling of like not defensiveness, but it's just work that I have to do. There's still unlearning I have to do, and there's an innate kind of like defensiveness that you're taught in the Zionist pipeline, and it's something I'm still unlearning, and that's not gonna stop. That's until I die. That's my whole life is gonna be unlearning and relearning, and I'm always learning new things, and I'm always finding ways to contradict things that I've learned in the past. And I always bring a journal with me to every event because anytime anyone opens their mouth, I always want to jot down what they have to say because I think that there's great value in kind of just like being quiet and listening to the people around you. I think a lot of people are really loud. I'm really loud all the time. And so something that I've really leaned into the last few months has just been showing up to events and quietly taking notes and going home and thinking about the contradictions that I'm sitting with and the contradictions that I was raised in and making sense of those things. And I think that being a perpetual student is not a kind of a title so much as it is like a job. Like it's an occupation, it's work. And I think that there's a real resistance to being a perpetual student because I think again there's like this savior complex that has invaded Jewish life where we feel like we know everything. And I think that that's really goofy. And I think it comes from a place of whiteness, and Jewish supremacy. And I think that challenging that feeling and challenging that instinct and challenging people who embody that is really important. And you do that by being a student of the Palestinian struggle. At the end of the day, we will never have anything more important to say than a Palestinian person on Palestine ever, or anything novel to say. So I think it's just about being useful where we can and learning where we can. And so I don't know, that's kind of where I am. I feel I'm the same person that I was when the Palestinian comrade reached out to me in 2020 and said, you need to be quiet and listen to me. I'm that same person because that's still something I'm trying to practice, is being quiet and listening, and understanding what accountability looks like in the context of Jewishness, in the context of Zionism, in the context of my past. What does it look like to have been a Zionist and now to be in movement spaces? What does it mean to be accountable, to do the work? And, I've come to the conclusion that being the perpetual student, again, like I said, it's a quiet and a slow occupation, but it's a job. And I think that it's something we all should take very seriously.
I don't think that education is so causal or so linear, but I wonder if you have any insight into this. It seems like the real lesson here is learning to listen, whether that's the big moment of why did you listen when a Palestinian person was saying you gotta not go down this pipeline, or in these small moments, not small moments, in these more micro moments of listening at a protesting. Somebody needs to take up the writing of the pedagogy of protests, but I don't think you can identify this is why it happens to me and this is what it looks like. But I find myself getting caught out. I remember early on when I started to be anti-Zionist, I had those very familiar moments like, oh, I'm an anti-Zionist. Wait, why does From the River to the Sea make me uncomfortable? Oh no, I'm an anti-Zionist. Oh, why do I hate hearing the word intifada? Like then you keep doing it, and then you think, at some point you realize I'm never going to reach an end goal here. The end goal is to always be in the process. But I do wonder, how do you keep this listening ear open to being open to this constant unmaking and remaking?
I think that's what being an organizer is. That's what being a comrade and a community member is. I'm in spaces where people are calling me in and challenging me every day and are offering critique and advice from a place of love. I'm in spaces like the Palestine Solidarity Working Group where, my fellow members of steering will say, actually, maybe this is how we should do it. I think being someone who calls themselves an organizer, first of all, that's super pretentious, be quiet. And second of all, it means being a student and it means listening. And the way that I do that is by being, again, fortunate because I'm surrounded by people who are patient and by people who know that I can be better and I can do better and that I want to do better. And I also think you have to humble yourself. I think you really have to check your ego at the door. I think you cannot walk into any organizing space and think you're the smartest person in the room or think you have a right to be there beyond anyone else. I think it's really important to make sure that, you are participating when you're organizing things, to participate in that organizing as an organizer, but also as like a member of the public, because that's what you are. You're a public servant. And I think that I live in the South at a time where there are brilliant, brilliant, brilliant people around me. And there's literature being produced constantly that I'm lucky to read and be able to have access to. And I think that if I didn't listen, I mean, I would be ridiculous. Constantly information is being poured at me and being given to me, and it's very gracious of the people who are raising me as an organizer. Like the people around me right now, they're raising me as an organizer, and some of those relationships are full of tension, and some of those relationships are up and down, but I'm learning how to be a person because of people in PYM and people in SJP and people in PSL, DSA and Al Auda and all these orgs locally. I'm learning how to be a person by watching interpersonal relationships unfold and by keeping my ear open. And I think again, it's just really about humbling yourself and knowing when to be quiet.
Today's episode was produced by Yardain Amran, Samantha Haley, and me. The music is produced by Yardain. If you like our episodes, please subscribe, follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Please rate us. Also, please check out our Instagram page where another ed is possible. On that Instagram page, we share more information about our guests and their work. Moreover, We regularly post Gaza mutual aid campaigns, which we hope folks will support. This week we'll be sharing some of the campaigns that Anna suggests. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.